our air cargo specialist, Eric Coolidge, who's going to be joining us with a top story today, and that's going to take us to Amsterdam, the Netherlands, to talk about some flowers and also some airport updates as well. Eric Coolidge joins us this morning. Eric, thanks so much for being here.
Good morning, Anthony. How are you?
Doing well, excited to jump into this topic. So there's a lot going on, of course, with oil, with gas, with Russia, with flowers. Eric, where do you want to start off here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's kind of like, I wrote a couple stories of another one in the pipeline, kind of a trifecta of stories, kind of all loosely hinging around the Ukraine issue. But initially, I think the one story you're referring to is Amsterdam Schiphol Airport's one of the biggest airports in Europe. And, I was at an air cargo conference last week and was talking to some of their folks, and it's just interesting how the ripple effects of the Ukraine war have hit unintended targets. And, as we all know, all the effects from, lack of wheat shipments and higher gas prices and inflation and the, lack of shipping to Russia have all been impacts. But, the ban on flying, the U.S. and EU ban on flying Russian aircraft over their airspace and technology bans, and then also the U.S. ban basically says if you have a Boeing aircraft, you can't even fly it without a license. So every time you want to take off, you got to apply for a license, which basically has grounded fleets of Boeing aircraft operated by Russian carriers. And so Schiphol, their second largest cargo airline, was a company called Airbridge Cargo, I think registered in the UK, but owned by Russian interests. And they had an all Boeing fleet, about 17 jumbo jets, 747 freighters, and a 777. And basically they're out of business. They can't fly them. The leasing companies are trying to get the aircraft back. And so, cargo's down at Schiphol for several reasons that we've talked about because of the economy. But that was kind of a big hit for them, and they're trying to fill that up now with cargo from other airlines that are kind of filling the breach because there's fewer slots available there. So freighter companies are eager to get some of those slots that Airbridge had.
Eric, I know when we first started talking about Russian sanctions and kind of those unintended consequences, we talked a lot about the maintenance and the service of these aircraft because they weren't going to be allowed to fly. You weren't performing regular maintenance checks on them. Is that an issue that we're seeing as well in these surrounding countries?
Yeah, well, I mean, if they're no country that's in the U.S., the European Union, several of the Nordic countries, and others that have applied sanctions, they basically have said, you can't interact with these planes. So these planes can't fly, or have any maintenance or any kind of service done on them, or even navigation service to help them take off. Or fueling. So because there could potentially be secondary sanctions on someone else. So no one's touching those planes. They don't want that liability. And the Russians aren't really flying anywhere with them. But some of the Russian airlines, the parent company of this Airbridge Cargo is a company called Volga Dnieper, based in Moscow, and they're flying some of their Russian-built Antonov and Ilyushin super freighters on some limited runs to Asia and India and Pakistan and Azerbaijan and the United Arab Emirates, places like that, to kind of maintain these logistics corridors to get things into some of the cities in Russia. So they're very careful what types of planes they fly and where out of the country.
So Eric, with that and having to be so extra cautious around the type of planes and the way that they're going, has there been any shift to different modes of transport across Europe and trying to avoid that Eastern European Russian airspace and even Ukraine, really just to get out of the way of the conflict there? Have you seen other companies, other countries kind of maybe shifting modes a little bit and relying less on air cargo?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know exactly where things stand right now. Before the war broke out, there was, a lot of interest in use of the European to China transcontinental railroad system. And there was, some of these railroads between China, Russia, and in Europe were linked together. And so you could build these large trains, and instead of shipping around the world by ocean or flying, you could use that option. With the war, at least one of those routes is out of action, and so I don't think it's technically against sanctions to use the rail, but I think a lot of companies are staying away from it because they're worried if Russia, change their mind or seize their cargo en route. So I think there's some look at some alternative routes through Iran, but it gets very complicated. So I'm not really sure where that stands. I think, any volumes that are going that way are very low right now.
And Eric, right now, Russia is really starting to build up a lot of cash just because they can't spend a lot of the money because sanctions are really eating them up right now. With so much cash on hand, do you see them potentially being able to maybe convince a gray party or potentially someone that doesn't quite fall on either side of this situation to kind of help them circumvent some resources here?
I mean, I think countries that aren't participating in the sanctions obviously are trading or can ship to and from Russia, but they still might want to do it carefully. But the one of the owners of this Volga Dnieper group, he talked about expanding their fleet of their Russian-built aircraft, which also include these Antonov AN-124 freighters. These are massive planes that load from the front and the back with ramps so you can drive trucks on them and so forth. And they have a fleet of a dozen of these, and they have 5 of these Ilyushin 76 planes. And so he's talking about the Russian industry revamping or restarting up, or maybe placing orders for more of these planes from within the domestic economy. So I guess they're going to try and be more self-sufficient in that regard.
And Eric, so we talked about flowers to tease out this story, and flowers are one of Amsterdam's main exports, cut flowers. You probably know Dutch tulips.
Right.
And so let's talk a little bit about that, how it's impacting that industry, because I would think that air cargo is something that you would need to use for floral exports, right? They're really time-sensitive, temperature-sensitive products.
Exactly. And, tulips or flowers are the number one export for the Netherlands, the Netherlands is the number one exporter of cut flowers in the world. They have this huge facility there where all the flowers come from around the world, Africa and Europe, and it's basically a wholesale market, and then everything gets distributed around the world. So Skiple's very involved with that, and Airbridge Cargo was a big part of that. Russia was a good market for exporting those flowers, so that's all gone away, and so that's one reason their cargo volumes are down.
To try to fill this void.
There's another interesting aspect of this too. There's a Ukrainian airline called Antonov Airlines. They use some of those AN-124s too that were built in Ukraine, and they're very interesting company. They basically got, had to rush out or evacuate from Ukraine, and they have a handful of these planes, and they've been operating humanitarian flights mostly, or NATO flights in support of Ukraine, bringing stuff into Poland and other countries. And they just said they're relocating their base or setting up in Leipzig Hall Airport in Germany. So temporarily till Ukraine's free again, they are going to stay there and operate from there. And they're doing some project cargo runs. They just ran a gas turbine from one of the Nordic countries or Latvian countries down to Nigeria. So that's an interesting how they're trying to stay in business still.
And that seems like a pretty good strategy, right? If you have the resources and the ability to pull out of Ukraine right now, then you absolutely should if you're allowed to relocate somewhere else. Do you see any other companies, whether that's an air cargo company or any other companies really just in general involved in Ukraine right now, taking that same strategy and taking their operations elsewhere, at least temporarily?
I mean, they were the main air cargo operator in Ukraine. There was probably some small ones, but I don't know about what trucking companies have done. I know some. There's some companies that are trying to get mail between Kyiv and other countries surrounding them through, trucking networks. So I'm sure that a lot of the Ukrainian trucking companies and the rail are operating to whatever extent they can, but I'm not aware of any other companies, relocating. Software companies, non-asset-based companies may have relocated a lot of their staffs and are operating from elsewhere.
Eric, one last question before we let you go. When the entire Russia-Ukraine conflict started, you were one of the first people to bring forward some knowledge about some humanitarian efforts and funds being raised to go into the country. Do you have any updates, kind of putting you on the spot here, sorry for that. Do you have any updates on any of these fundraising efforts by chance, or do you know if there's still that effort being put forth for the Ukrainian people?
That's a great question, and I need to check on that. Let me get back to you on my next appearance. I'll check on that. I thought about that myself. Was actually thinking of donating to some of these folks again, but I haven't seen from the logistics companies any appeals or any, appeals for donations lately. So that makes me wonder. So I'll check.
Eric, thanks so much for being on this morning. Always great to have you. Looking forward to the next time.
Take care, you guys. Thanks a lot.
All right, Eric, and you can follow his stuff on both freightwaves.com and on American Shipper, where he writes a ton about the air cargo sector, as well as dabbling a little bit in ocean and maritime as well.